The night began with an air of calm professionalism, but something simmered just beneath the surface. Jimmy Kimmel was no stranger to bold questions or edgy humor, yet few expected him to take on someone like Clint Eastwood, especially not in the way he did. Clint had appeared on the show to promote his latest directorial project, a film rooted in themes of honor, sacrifice, and the erosion of American values. It was supposed to be a conversation about art and legacy. What it became was anything but that. As Clint walked onto the stage, there was a moment of polite applause. He gave a brief nod to the audience, his trademark calm etched into the deep lines of his weathered face. Kimmel opened with light banter, the kind of warm-up he typically used to ease into interviews, but from the very first question, the tone shifted. Instead of asking about the film's message, Kimmel pressed Clint on his worldview, accusing the legendary actor of pushing outdated ideals disguised as patriotism. The tension was subtle at first, wrapped in the soft fabric of a smile, but Clint's eyes began to harden. Clint responded coolly, unshaken but clearly annoyed. There was an unmistakable weight in his demeanor, as if he had heard 1,000 versions of this accusation before. But rather than letting it slide, he leaned forward, drawing a clear line between artistic vision and political commentary. Kimmel, sensing the friction, pushed harder. He questioned not only the themes in Clint's movie, but the man himself, tying Clint's past roles and public remarks into a broader critique of what he called America's refusal to change. The audience shifted in their seats. Some chuckled awkwardly, unsure of whether to support the host or the icon before them. Clint's presence was commanding, and even Kimmel seemed to feel it, despite trying to dominate the moment. What started as subtle jabs grew sharper. Kimmel's tone lost its polish, and Clint's voice, though quiet, carried a force that quieted the laughter. Clint's frustration was not loud or theatrical, but it was real. He had come not just to speak about a film, but to defend a vision of storytelling that he felt was under siege. For him, the craft was sacred, built on decades of experience and a belief in unflinching truth. Kimmel, on the other hand, seemed determined to reframe that truth through a modern lens, one that Clint refused to accept. As the segment wore on, the mood darkened, the laughter grew less frequent, and even the house band's interludes sounded hollow. Clint's face remained still, but his eyes now glared with an unmistakable fire. Kimmel, perhaps sensing that he had poked too hard, tried to pivot with a joke. It fell flat. Then, as if abandoning all pretense of humor, he asked Clint whether he believed he was helping or harming today's generation. The question hung in the air. Clint didn't blink. The crowd waited. And then, slowly, deliberately, Clint leaned forward in his chair. Clint's posture said everything. He leaned in, elbows resting on his knees, his fingers laced together like a man preparing to deliver a verdict. The tension in the room turned brittle. Lights still shone, cameras still rolled, but something had changed. The playful showmanship of a late-night program had given way to something more serious, more volatile. Clint Eastwood wasn't there to be mocked, and he certainly wasn't there to explain himself to a man who had built his fame on sarcastic takedowns and scripted applause. He began to speak, but this time there was no softness to his tone. It was not a shout, not a rant, but a measured delivery that carried the force of conviction. He spoke about responsibility, about what it meant to be a creator in a world obsessed with surface-level outrage and empty virtue. He spoke about discipline, about telling stories not to win points or provoke cheers, but to reflect something deeper, even if that truth made people uncomfortable. Jimmy sat back in his chair, visibly trying to regain control of the narrative, but Clint wasn't giving him an inch. The older man's words were hitting their mark, not because they were clever, but because they were honest. Kimmel cracked another attempt at a joke, this one tinged with sarcasm, hinting that maybe Clint just missed the days when no one questioned his authority. It was meant to be disarming, But it only made things worse. Clint's jaw tightened. For a brief moment he looked away from Jimmy, staring past the cameras, as though searching for the last shred of patience he had left. And when he looked back, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. He challenged Jimmy, not with theatrics, but with a simple, cutting observation about the kind of cultural shallowness that turns serious conversations into trending clips and empty applause. The audience was now silent. People glanced nervously at one another. This wasn't what they had come for. But no one dared leave or look away. Even the crew had gone still, sensing something rare unfolding. Kimmel, perhaps realizing that he had pushed a living legend into open confrontation, tried to shift again, this time appealing to Clint's age. He hinted that maybe Clint's values belonged to another time, and that this generation had outgrown such ideals. That, more than anything, seemed to push Clint to the edge. His expression hardened. His voice, still calm, carried the weight of a man who had spent his life watching the country change. Some of it for the better, much of it not. He rejected the idea that age equated to irrelevance. If anything, he argued, it gave him the clarity to see what others could not. He drew on decades of experience to dismantle Jimmy's insinuations, showing that truth, honor, and grit were not relics, but necessities. Kimmel sat there, his rehearsed wit now failing him. There were no applause signs flashing above the audience, no producers rushing to cue a commercial break. It was just two men at a crossroads, one armed with confidence, the other clearly scrambling to salvage control. For a few seconds, even Jimmy seemed to reflect on the possibility that maybe he had underestimated who he was facing. And then Clint did something unexpected. He turned the tables. He stopped talking about himself and instead started asking Jimmy questions. Not humorous ones, not rhetorical ones, but sincere questions. He wanted to know what Jimmy stood for beyond the cue cards, beyond the studio laughs, beyond the curated controversies. It was not an attack. It was a challenge to rise above the role of entertainer and speak like a man. And that, more than anything Clint had said before, was what really shook the room. The silence that followed Clint's pointed questions was heavier than anything spoken aloud. Jimmy Kimmel, for all his charm and command over a crowd, looked briefly like someone who had wandered out of his depth. The studio lights still burned, overhead, but the glow seemed harsher now, less flattering. Clint Eastwood, with all his years and grit, had shifted the momentum of the room in a way few could. And by asking Jimmy to speak plainly, to put down the persona and show the man beneath, he had thrown a spotlight in an unexpected direction. Jimmy stammered at first. He tried to pivot, to reduce the moment to something harmless, brushing off Clint's challenge with a remark about how no one tunes into his show expecting philosophy. The crowd chuckled, grateful for the release. But Clint didn't laugh. He didn't nod or soften. He simply sat back, his silence now doing more than his words had. And that silence worked like a mirror. Jimmy, feeling its pressure, slowly dropped. The grin. He leaned forward, searching for something real to say. For a brief moment he did try. He spoke about his own background, about trying to balance humor with responsibility in a world that demanded opinions on every issue, but the attempt faltered midway. It lacked the weight of conviction. It was as if Jimmy wanted to be vulnerable, but not too much, wanted to engage, but not at the risk of being wrong. And that, more than anything, exposed the gap between him and Clint. Clint's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the energy between them. The age difference, once framed as a generational clash, now looked more like a gulf in understanding. Where Clint had decades of consequence etched into his voice, Jimmy seemed to rely on the expectation that charm would carry him through. It didn't. Not this time. Then came the turning point. Sensing the audience's mood slipping out of his control, Jimmy attempted to regain dominance with a direct accusation. He suggested that Clint's insistence on timeless values was a refusal to accept modern progress, that perhaps the world no longer needed men who spoke like relics from another era. His tone wasn't just dismissive, it bordered on personal, as though he were tired of Clint being held up as a moral compass. It was a misstep. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. But his reply was sharper than anything he'd said before. He broke down the idea that tradition meant stagnation. He explained how strength could coexist with compassion, how discipline didn't have to clash with change, and how being rooted in something real was not the same as being frozen in time. His words were not defensive. They were offensive in the purest sense, cutting through the noise with clarity, and for the first time, Jimmy had nothing ready. The audience had gone from uncertain to captivated. Some even began to applaud, not at a punchline, but at the force of Clint's integrity. Jimmy glanced nervously toward the camera crew, clearly signaling for a transition, a break, anything to ease the intensity. But there was no rescue coming. Clint had made sure of that by refusing to play by the usual rules. Now, instead of an interview, it was a reckoning. The next few minutes passed like a high-wire act. Jimmy asked a few more questions, but they were hollow. Clint answered, but only when he felt like it. What had started as a feature segment had turned into something else entirely, a moment of unexpected truth on a stage not built for it. Even viewers at home could likely feel the discomfort through the screen. Then, just as the energy threatened to collapse under its own weight, Clint made a final remark, not about himself, not even about Jimmy, but about the kind of courage it takes to admit when you are wrong. And he let that statement hang in the air as the camera slowly panned to Jimmy's face, searching for any sign that he understood what had just happened. Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen for a moment, the silence pressing down like the weight of an unseen crowd. His smirk had faded, replaced by something unfamiliar: uncertainty. Clint Eastwood's words had landed not as insults, but as undeniable truths, echoing through the studio with a strange gravity. For once, the cameras weren't the most important observers in the room. Every eye, from the producers behind the scenes to the quietest corners of the audience, was locked onto the man behind the desk, waiting to see what he would do next. Jimmy shifted in his chair, trying to speak, but whatever came to mind didn't survive the journey to his mouth. The usual rhythm of the show had been obliterated. There was no going back to commercial breaks or playful banter. Clint had drawn a line and dared him to step over it, not for the sake of winning an argument, but to find out whether Jimmy was capable of facing something real. Still, Jimmy tried. He launched into a monologue that felt half-prepared, filled with vague appeals to empathy and change, touching on generational differences, media responsibilities, and the dangers of platforming outdated perspectives. On paper, it might have played well. But Clint wasn't a paper figure. He was a man who had lived what he spoke. And in the shadow of that lived experience, Jimmy's speech sounded more like a plea to restore control than a genuine reflection. Clint didn't interrupt. He watched patiently, his expression unreadable. He had no desire to dominate the moment because, in truth, he already had. The debate had shifted. The question wasn't whether Clint could defend his beliefs. It was whether Jimmy could rise, to meet them with something more than showmanship. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jimmy, perhaps trying to retake the emotional high ground, referenced a past controversy involving Clint. He brought up a film scene, years old. One critics had called insensitive. It was a calculated move, the kind of trick often used to trap a guest into self-defense. But Clint didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned in again, this time with a calm that was almost chilling, and spoke about the difference between art and approval. He explained that art, real art, is not made to satisfy the moment, but to challenge it. That sometimes the truth stings, and that discomfort is part of progress. He said the problem wasn't with disagreement, but with the fear of being uncomfortable. The moment you start creating to avoid criticism, you stop creating altogether. The audience listened, many with brows furrowed, their applause forgotten. They were learning something they hadn't expected to hear from a man they thought they already understood. Jimmy looked cornered, and for the first time in years, he seemed unsure whether the crowd was still on his side. The tension built once more, not with shouting or scandal, but with two opposing worldviews locked in a standstill. Jimmy represented a culture of faster takes and quick validation. Clint stood for reflection, substance, and the long game. The audience now had to decide not just who they believed, but which world they wanted to belong to. Eventually, Jimmy tried to steer the show forward, tossing in a self-deprecating joke to cut the intensity. It didn't land. Clint simply sat, back in his chair, his point made, the fire still quietly burning in his gaze. The host scrambled to change topics, even mentioning another guest waiting backstage, as if pretending the clash hadn't just left a mark on the entire studio. But it had. The next guest never came out. Not that night. The energy had shifted too far, too fast, and the crew knew better than to force it. The segment ended with awkward applause, a forced smile, and a camera pan that did its best to hide the discomfort. Clint didn't ask for a car, to be called. He didn't need an exit cue. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked calmly off stage. No fanfare, no waves, just a silent departure that left more behind than any punchline could erase. The aftermath of Clint Eastwood's appearance rippled far beyond the studio walls. Overnight, clips circulated with feverish speed. Commentators, bloggers, and fans weighed in from every corner of the internet. But what emerged wasn't just noise. It was a reckoning. Viewers were divided, not along political lines, but along something deeper. Some praised Clint for refusing to play along with the artificial rhythm of late-night television. Others criticized Jimmy Kimmel for allowing the show to veer so far from its intended course, and exposing how shallow the usual conversations often were. For once, the public discourse wasn't focused on scandal, but on substance. People weren't dissecting what Clint had said for its shock value. They were examining the meaning behind his words. There were discussions about the purpose of entertainment, the role of tradition in storytelling, and the place of moral conviction in a culture obsessed with constant reinvention. Clint had not just disrupted a show. He had cracked open a wider conversation that many were no longer able to ignore. Back at the studio, the tension lingered. Jimmy's team moved quickly, editing the episode for syndication, trying to smooth over the jagged edges without erasing what had happened. They cut to commercial earlier than aired, adjusted the tone of the segment introductions, and debated whether to even publish the full interview online. But the damage, or transformation, depending on who you asked, had already been done. Jimmy himself kept quiet for several days. No statements, no follow-up jabs. Behind the scenes, those close to him said he was shaken, not because of public reaction, but because Clint's challenge had struck something personal. He was used to confronting politicians, celebrities, even scandals, but this wasn't that. This was a mirror held up in real time, and it had reflected something back that Jimmy wasn't prepared to see. Clint, meanwhile, carried on with his usual rhythm. He didn't bask in the headlines or issue clarifications. He gave a quiet interview to a small independent magazine where he spoke briefly about the incident, describing it only as an overdue conversation. When asked if he regretted how the night unfolded, he simply said that when you speak from truth, regret doesn't usually follow. The story eventually slipped out of the news cycle, replaced by the next viral controversy. But it never really left the people who watched it. For many, it marked a moment where entertainment collided with integrity, where one man's refusal to dilute his voice challenged everyone else to examine their own. Even viewers who didn't agree with Clint found themselves thinking differently about how quickly they dismissed ideas they didn't understand. In the months that followed, Jimmy subtly changed. His show remained sharp, but there was a new undercurrent to it, something slower, more thoughtful. He began inviting guests not just for their fame, but for their perspective. He allowed pauses to linger longer, let answers sit heavier, and, when someone mentioned Clint Eastwood's name during a later taping, Jimmy didn't mock or deflect. He paused, nodded slightly, and moved on. Clint, as always, never asked for thanks. He had walked onto that stage not looking for approval or redemption. He simply refused to be talked over, diminished, or boxed into someone else's version of who he was supposed to be. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that silence can be louder than laughter, that conviction can rattle even the smoothest performances, and that truth, when spoken clearly, has a way of echoing long after the lights go out.